And welcome. I'm so looking forward to this episode because I have Jason Pack here. Jason is a senior analyst with the NATO Foundation, the host of the Disorder podcast. He has spent years living in the Middle East. He's a contributor to the New York Times, the Financial Times, the Wall Street Journal, and he's an all-around smart, charming individual. And we're going to have a great conversation. We came to just talk Epstein, but a little war broke out in the Middle East between now and then, and the two are not unrelated. So we're going to dive right in. Jason, welcome.
Great to be with you, Michael.
Yeah, I mean, when you and I were exchanging emails, we were talking just straight Epstein, and then the Iran war broke out. And with your education, your specialty, I said, well, we got to talk Iran. And as it turns out, it's not unrelated to Epstein anyway.
It sure isn't. What I think we're witnessing is the wars of endless, epic Epstein distraction. And my joke on this point is that in 1701, the Bourbons launched the War of Spanish Succession when their cousins, the other Bourbons in Spain, died, and there was a tussle for the Spanish throne. And both Venezuela and now this other regime decapitation operation in Iran are attempts by the Trump administration to keep the attention off the fact that he is in the files and Republican senators and Congress people have questions that Pam Bondi does not want to have to answer.
Yeah, well, that's absolutely true. Although I do see other connections as well that are not unrelated to Epstein, in that Epstein was not just a pedophile, but he was also a corrupt individual that connected wealthy people around the world. And it doesn't seem unrelated to me that the Qatars, actually, what did that be? The Qataris? I heard you say it on a podcast. The Qataris give Donald Trump a $500 million jet as a gift. United Arab Emirates invested $500 million into Donald Trump's bullshit crypto scam. The Saudis gave Jared Kushner, I think now it was something, at first it was reported $2 billion. I think it turned out to be more like $4 billion.
Who's counting?
And how could you count? And how many things are off the books that we don't even know about? And that these are people who have been competing hegemonically for control of that region. And Iran is probably their greatest adversary. And not the joke, but the comparison I have been making is, I said, America is starting to feel like exactly who we fought against to get this country. No, not the British, the people that George Washington actually rode across the Delaware to fight, the Hessians, that we are just a mercenary army for hire. Except, at least in the case of the Prussians and the Hessians, the monies probably went directly into the coffers of that government. These monies go directly into Trump's pocket, and then our armies go fight on their behalf. Am I crazy in thinking that that analogy is an apt one?
So there are so many interesting strands to pull at here, Michael. One, the founders of our country were very worried about a president who could receive private donations from foreign sources. Hence, we have the emoluments clause of the Constitution.
Right.
And they were terrified of a president who could start wars without consulting Congress. Hence, they put a requirement that a declaration of war be made and that go through the Congress. So those are the two things about this war which are clearly impeachable, right? That the executive's non-following through on the need for Congress to declare war, and then the president's private personal interests, as well as those of Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner, with a range of Gulfi and Israeli interlocutors. However, I want to point out, despite those illegalities, it doesn't mean that there is not something wise of standing up to the tyrannical, terrorist-supporting regime of the Ayatollahs and making good the threat that if you kill 20, 30, 40,000 of your own peaceful protesters, they'll be held to pay. And that's why, even when we are speaking in a largely sane center-left and left echo chamber, we do need to point out, as dumb and illegal as much of what Trump does, there can be an element of deterrence or principle. And we need to try to disentangle those as we're discussing it.
Yeah, that's the making lemonade out of lemons, essentially. And I did have an Iranian dissident on my show last week, who she said that they would prefer America stay out of it. That they felt like that this was their fight. And I'm hearing reports that the young people of Iran, who at, just a week and a half ago would have said to their parents, like, I don't understand why you call America the Great Satan. We like America. Now that the bombs are falling, the young generation who was open to America are starting to say, oh, I'm starting to get that whole Great Satan thing.
I think that sounds a little over-egged to me.
Yeah.
Obviously, you can present views from both sides.
Sure.
I can give you an Iranian dissident or protester with family in the diaspora in Sweden and in Los Angeles who is thrilled that the bombs are falling. Sure. And I can find you another one who's like, I can't believe it. We were just on the verge potentially of overthrowing the regime, and this will set us back because it makes us look like we're in cahoots with foreign, conspirators, and we can't be seen to be working with the Israelis. So I can give you instantly people on both sides of this.
Absolutely.
It would seem to be that the majority of the people who supported the protest rallies, and we're talking an international, fairly educated, youthful set, are largely in support of this campaign. I mean, everything from the reporting of BBC to, Middle East on the ground outlets would push in that direction, right? Sure. And it does seem that the Iranian diasporas in the US, UK, and Sweden are also largely supportive. Absolutely. The problem is how we got to here, which is connected to why there's no Trumpian endgame. And if their support will dissipate when it's 3 or 4 weeks from now, and the war is not quote unquote over, and no moment of unification of the resistance has happened, then, those figures may tip.
Absolutely. And I live in Los Angeles where, you just mentioned there's a large Persian community, and they are in the streets celebrating in support of the war. And I'm hopeful that they topple the regime. As you know, we talked about in emails, I'm an anti-theist, and I don't want any theocracies in the world, particularly ones as brutal as they have in Iran. So yes, it's always a good thing, although I do find it a little bit ironic that the man brought to power by Christian nationalists / Christian supremacists, which I think Pete Hegseth and his friends certainly are, would be the ones to overthrow a theocracy, because they seem to be trying to build one of their own in America.
That may not be as counterintuitive as you claim, because every theocratic or civilizationist argument is inherently opposed to the others.
Yeah.
So that taking the Ayatollahs down a peg could be justifying that white nationalist Christian message, because we all know that white Christian nationalism couldn't be further away from the words of Jesus of turning the other cheek, and, a rich man can't get to heaven. It's harder than going a camel through the eye of a needle. All of their things contradict Jesus's message. And Jonathan Rauch has written about this a lot better than I can explain it on this podcast. But there is something coherent to his civilizationalist message. Not that it means it's going to end well.
Yeah. Which I guess can kind of get us a little bit into Epstein, because I mentioned that they are, in fact, Christian supremacists. And there is buried in the Epstein files a certain narrative that Epstein himself was a Jewish supremacist and had some weird genealogical designs. Could you speak to that a little bit? Am I crazy or am I reading the wrong blogs when I say that it seems like he was trying to spread the seed of, I believe, specifically Ashkenazi Jewish people because he thought that they were superior to all other humans?
This is a very uncomfortable topic.
Of course.
I think that you can find a lot in the Epstein files. And yes, there is a Jewish supremacist or Ashkenazi supremacist aspect.
Yeah.
But some of it in the files is tongue-in-cheek and playing with the idea that anti-Semites who believe in the protocols of the Elders of Zion say that about Jews, and we're kind of doing our own thing, which is similar to what they say. It's difficult to piece together if he actually believed that. I would direct listeners who are interested in that to the Jewish Currents podcast, which is a very left-wing anti-Zionist, but yet Jewish-themed podcast, and it investigates Epstein's ties to the Mossad and Epstein's connections to Jewish supremacist ideas, and concludes something more along the lines of what I would be comfortable with, which is that capitalism is the conspiracy, and particularly neoliberal globalist capitalism, of which obviously Epstein and his network were majority Jews, and he was able to find exactly those ones who didn't believe enough in any kind of principles, Jewish, Christian, or otherwise, so as to manipulate and rape young women and also rip off their own business partners and countries. I think that I want to push back against the anti-theist position here. Mm-hmm. It is, to me, very critical to point out that even if Epstein used a certain ethnic network, and even if Trump appeals to white Christian evangelicals, neither of those men believe in God or the principles of those religions, because the very belief in those principles would mitigate against the ability to launch an unprovoked war, manipulate very vulnerable young women, because that's so against the religious message that if you think that there is a day of judgment, I just find it very, very hard for me to believe that these men, if they really believed in the sacred books, would be able to undertake these actions. And of course, you can point to the grooming scandal of young boys within the Catholic Church and say, but look, they were quote unquote believers. But I think that there are some key differences.
Well, I would say that, just in pushing back against that a little bit, that at the top of many religious movements, you find a non-believer. I would say that the pastor at the average megachurch couldn't possibly believe that a judgment day is coming as he rips off old ladies for their pensions. Yeah. So, and you know, it does occur to me, and we'll get past this quickly, though, that very often the person that claims to be in direct contact with the creator of the universe, miraculously, the creator of the universe always says several things that seem similar, which is everyone should give you their money and everyone should give you their daughters. And so I find the person who believes the message the least is the person pronouncing it the loudest.
Touche. And religious charisma and political charisma and manipulative CIA asset charisma are all connected, so that there is something very worrying here. Yeah. In other words, the skill that Trump and Epstein and the founder of the Mormon Church, or
that's who I was
a cult in Waco, have in common is very similar. There is a similarity of their charismas and the charismatic networks that they were able to build on them. So absolutely, I understand that.
So let's rewind all the way back, because you said a number of things on a podcast that I was listening to with you that even for somebody who's, you know, I wouldn't say obsessed, but possibly others might say I'm obsessed with Epstein. I certainly read a lot about it. I've gone through the files myself. But what you were saying I found really interesting is that this wasn't news to so many people. And you started with gynecologists in Manhattan back in the day. Can you tell me a little bit about that?
Sure. Obviously, we're all drinking from a fire hose at maximum openness and speed right now when it comes to information and revelations about Epstein, because even in the first tranche of documents, there were more documents than one human could ever consume. And now, as more things are coming out, and the realization that there are yet other documents which are not even in the 3 million unreleased documents, meaning things that he had taken away from his Palm Beach estate, which he knew was going to be raided, there is just so much information. You mentioned the gynecologist. I mentioned this as a tidbit, not only because it's sick, but because I think it's revealing. He worked with some Upper East Side elite gynecologists and fed them a stream of 3 to 5 women a week for STD checkups and other, how are things going on down there kind of pre-orgy checkups. Some of them called NYPD and, like, what's going on? How can this one guy be paying the bills for, even one brothel couldn't consume this many, new clientele. And that stuff was buried. I can point you to the Netflix documentary, which was made, it's called Filthy Rich, long before the Epstein emails were released. And it speaks of 2 women who were found out by Vanity Fair, 2 survivors. Yeah. And they were sisters. And Epstein bought one of the one's paintings and then concocted a way to fly the sister to his ranch in New Mexico and molested her.
Yeah.
And they were going to go public via this Vanity Fair article. And Epstein killed the article by threatening the editor of Vanity Fair. What the gynecologist thing and the Vanity Fair article have in common is that the cover-up has been going on for 20 years. And I couldn't be more anti-conspiratorial. I think QAnon is as much bollocks as any kind of man in the sky. In other words, conspiracy theory, and, there's a magical day of judgment where the good people benefit. It's equally insane. But there was a conspiracy, which isn't a conspiracy theory. In other words, powerful elites around Epstein were connected to the media. David Brooks and Woody Allen and Noam Chomsky were over at his place. And what do you know? They happened to kill stories at the New Yorker and the New York Times about these issues. And that's the part that I want to write about and I want to be in the media about, because I want to be in the sane center where we can go back to Anglo-American cooperation and, slightly higher marginal tax rates on the wealthy and real climate science. And we have to trust experts to get there. But experts in the media have to be willing to say, you know what? There were a lot of experts and elites who, for a range of very unsavory reasons, killed the investigation of this story over 20 years. And I haven't heard that yet. Until I hear that in the New York Times, the Sunday Times here about Mandelson, the Telegraph, and elsewhere, I just think that this is going to get worse and worse and drive our politics to very insane extremes.
I would agree with that 100%. But you brought up something where there is something to this day so fishy going on, and perhaps you have some insights for us. As you mentioned, the ranch in New Mexico, the Zorro Ranch, never raided, never investigated. Currently, it's been purchased by a Christian nationalist who's claiming he's turning it into a Christian children's camp, but is not allowing. I mean, there's reports of, I know, wow, dude, the optics, sir, not great.
I decided to build this. I purchased Auschwitz and I was thinking we should make like a Reconstructionist synagogue.
Yeah. Crazy. Absolutely crazy. But here's the thing that there, see, I talk about it on the show all the time, the difference between an FBI intake form and an affidavit. FBI intake form, anyone could do it. I don't report on them. They have no teeth. More investigation needs to be done before you can determine there's a there. So the people that get up and are screaming and yelling about an FBI intake form and the sensational nature of it, I say, who cares? I could call the FBI right now and they would have to do an intake form, but it's the affidavits. But there is talk of, bodies buried on the Zorro Ranch. And we know that people were molested on the Zorro Ranch. And we know that, just the fact that it was one of Jeffrey Epstein's properties alone, it should have been investigated. Why was it never investigated? Why was it never raided? Why did the FBI never go there? And why now that it's in the news and people are talking about it, is it okay that this guy has shut down any further investigation and saying, no, you can't come on the property and excavate or look for bodies or look for evidence. It seems to me that the conspiracy goes on to this day.
Well, I think that's very credible, Michael. I am not knowledgeable about the details of what might have happened at that ranch. The girls in the Vanity Fair piece and the Netflix documentary were molested there. But any possible conspiracy of it was quickly sold off after he died so that it would be owned by someone loyal to Trump or the establishment and things couldn't be looked into is plausible. I can't assert that that is actually happening. I don't have any I don't have any privileged information. What I do know is that in the Obama years and Biden years, people were aware of this.
Yeah.
The Clintons were aware of more than they've said in their depositions. Anyone must grasp that. Ergo, there were reasons to not say it. Biden, if he was very, very worried about Trump winning, could have released some information. But I think due to his moral compass, he wouldn't have cherry-picked what to release. And he didn't want to release everything because a lot of the stuff makes a lot of Biden and Obama donors look not so great. And this is not conspiratorial to say this. It's that the conspiracy is real, or rather, I'm not doing a conspiracy theory. This is past the point of theorizing.
Yeah,
it's all
fact.
real. And we need to step back and analyze what this says about Davos man, the untaxed classes. And I think that we need to do this for people who are in the sane center and care about bipartisan coordination and confronting terrorism abroad and working with our allies in Europe and NATO. Because if we don't do it, it's going to be the fringe people who think that Bill Gates puts microchip in the vaccine and is controlling your thoughts through 5G networks, who will do this. If we don't do this work, there's always going to be someone further to the insane left who will do it. And to bring back the UK angle, obviously I have an American accent, but I'm based in London, and I used to work in DC, and I had this vision that I needed to get a European citizenship, and I think I was correct in that.
Yeah.
So I think the UK dimension is worth sharing here on two accounts. One, the Epstein phenomenon has a lot of connection here. His relationship with Lord Peter Mandelson was very important to his relationship with the former Prince Andrew, and then the Prime Minister, Sir Keir Starmer's relationship with Lord Mandelson, appointing him to be ambassador to the US, is part of the reason that he's losing in the polls here and has had to fire Mandelson, and now lost a very important by-election in the suburbs of Manchester called the Gordon and Denton by-election, where the Greens won the seat. It shall not be a surprise to hear that the Green Party has never won a by-election in UK history. Wow. And that the UK Green Party is, in American senses, far to the left of AOC or Sanders, more in the Rashida Tlaib side of things. And it has nothing to do with the environment anymore. It's just a far left party. And their policies are insane things like all workers should be able to afford to take foreign vacations.
Wow.
And it's like, how are you going to make that happen? So I see Starmer's appointing of Mandelson, inability to confront things, as part of the reason why the conversation just shifts further and further and further to the extreme left. Because if the center isn't willing to say, you know what, we looked into Lord Mandelson's ties to Epstein and that he actually did treason selling UK secrets to Epstein, and we knew to not hire him, but Keir isn't willing to do that. He's just constantly behind the times.
Yeah, that is so interesting. But you touched on the Biden thing, and maybe that doesn't get talked about enough, and I'm certainly not afraid of it. I was actually never a particularly huge fan of Joe Biden and became less so as I saw him throw the election to Trump by egotistically, foolishly, hubrisly, deciding to run for re-election when he was clearly not up for it. But that said, as anyone who debates online with Trump supporters, which I do, they will say, if there was anything in the files about Trump, why didn't Biden release it? And to which my first answer is always, well, there is stuff about Trump in the files. What are you even talking about anymore? But it is a good question. Why didn't he release it? You talked about it would look bad for donors, and you talked about it would look bad for Bill Clinton, that he certainly knew more. But others talk about his connections to Israel and Israeli intelligence and possibly other intelligence agencies. And why was Mendelsohn and the former Prince Andrew giving him detailed internal secrets from the British government if he was just dealing in underage girls? So do you have any insights into that? What could it have been? And you talked about Biden having a moral compass, and maybe he did. And Kamala Harris went on, I think maybe Jimmy Fallon or something, and said, well, we didn't talk to the attorney general. We didn't talk to the Justice Department like that because we respected that wall between executive and judicial branch. Okay, not a bad answer, I suppose. But what are your insights, Jason? Because the whole thing stinks.
It really does. I want to take this in two parts. The first part is, yes, the majority of people in the Epstein network are Democrats. That's true. Yes, many of the uber donors and extreme cultural elites in the Democratic camp appear in these Epstein files, particularly among the New York Jewish set, but then also certain Anglo-American and other types of personalities are overrepresented. So it stands to reason that not only Biden, but people at the AG's office were like, well, I don't know about this. Do you know what I mean? This would be too partisan, but then we could face blowback. I'll use the example of lots of stuff that Hillary could have said about the Benghazi investigation. You know, my expertise is Libya. I've written 2 books about Libya. I used to live there. She could have said things to exonerate herself very early on, and without getting into the details. But she didn't, because she was afraid this will make Chris Stevens look bad, and he's dead now. This will make other of my allies look bad. So this is a known phenomenon within centrist Democrat circles, is that they want to, let's just not have to deal with this. Let's cover this up and it'll go away. You know, Hillary was sick during the campaign and she had the flu and she didn't tell anyone, and she fell out of a car and she couldn't campaign. And then she said, well, I had the flu, but I didn't tell anyone. And it looked horrible. But I use that that is an instinct that I have experienced when I'm briefing the Huma Abedin's, Jake Sullivan's, Anthony Weiner's of the world. They didn't think that the Weiner laptop would get out, so they could just bury that. But it did get out because of Comey and a whole range of other reasons. So everything that I know about having briefed senior leadership within the centrist part of the Democratic Party is like, let's not talk about Benghazi. Let's not talk about Epstein. Do you know what I mean? Even if we're mostly right, the impulse is to cover up. And this is why the deeper that you reflect on the meaning of all of this, it leads to pushing our politics to the extreme left and extreme right. And in the UK spectrum, that's the Greens and Reform. And in the US spectrum, that's something like AOC over here. And, you know, the craziest MAGA versions, like this guy, what is it, Paxton in Texas?
Sure.
And I mentioned this because as we're speaking today, there's that primary going on in Texas. And I see, the deeper you read about Epstein, people are going to become so enraged that there has been a cover up in the center and a crossover. Like the idea that Bannon, Dershowitz, and Noam Chomsky were hanging out and advising Epstein together.
It sounds like a bad joke. Steve Bannon, Alan Dershowitz, and Woody Allen walk into a bar together. I mean, how could that be real? And yet it is. Noam Chomsky. Mind blown.
Well, what I find funny is that they were actually giving him media advice. My view as a linguist is that to rehabilitate your image, you should undertake this propaganda campaign.
Yeah. Yeah, Bannon as well. That was their project, was rehabilitating Jeffrey Epstein's image. Yeah, that's another rabbit hole we could go down. Just the cult of Epstein. I don't remember the guy's name. That reporter from CBS. One of the emails he wrote was like, "I go into withdrawal with Jeffrey Epstein withdrawal when I'm not with you." Another one he said was like, "I can't believe I see your amazing life and I can't tell anyone about it." What was?
I think that's actually Peter Attia who said that.
Yeah, that's right. That's right.
Um,
But these connections to Mossad, I mean, they seem real. It seems like there's a there there.
They are real.
Yeah.
So I've studied this a lot. Am I the world expert in this? No. And I want to put that forward, right?
Right.
He was an asset of multiple intelligence agencies. One, because he probably sought them out. And two, because as a man as networked and with as little principles as he had, any Russian or Mossad agent would love to get compromised. Oh my God, you have a underage sex video on so-and-so? Great. We'd love to pay for this. This will help us in our manipulation of that person. So
Yeah.
You could understand that the very nature of what he was doing lent itself to being an asset for intelligence agencies. But then because it's not really a sex scandal, it's an influence, power broking, and money scandal, which had a honeypot trap for a sex predator as a way to have that influence and that money access. We don't really know in the beginning how he got his money from Les Wexner. And the whole thing starts with Lex Wexner giving him power of attorney because Epstein wasn't wealthy. That was his first billionaire. That was the man who launched him to having his own private clients and not just working at Bear Stearns. And it seems to be, what do you know? He honey trapped him and he had compromise on him vis-a-vis sleeping with underage women. Ergo, that repeated itself a million times in different variations. We know about the issue of in the early 2000s when there were not, phone cameras of this quality,
Right.
using secret cameras, which then gave him power over other individuals.
They said
You
the
asked
whole
about
house was
Mossad.
bugged. Cameras in every room, obviously blackmail was his game.
Yeah, you asked about Mossad. Yes, he met with Ehud Barak, various retired Mossad and Shin Bet agents. He was not himself a Mossad agent. I think that that's really important to point out. He didn't have that training. He wouldn't have worked in this way. He was an asset. Was Ehud Barak doing stuff that he shouldn't have done with him? But it was mostly to make a buck. It wasn't, for Zionist domination, blah, 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 blah. He was also clearly working with the CIA. I mean, this stuff has come of his meeting with Burns and the CIA paying for an apartment for him where certain things happened at that apartment. God knows what happened at the apartment.
Is this the Manhattan apartment? Not the main house, but the one that it actually came out maybe a week and a half ago, 2 weeks ago, that the Israelis were in charge of security for the apartment. That one was in the name of his brother, but it was still a property controlled by Epstein.
Yeah, but the CIA paid for it.
Wow.
So he wasn't a Mossad asset. He wasn't a Mossad agent. He was a Mossad asset, but he was doing stuff for the CIA, and he was clearly too big to fail. What we've seen here is that just like with Lehman Brothers and other institutions in our globalized post-Cold War era, governments interact with corrupt individuals, corrupt financial institutions, and they end up having to bail them out because they are just too big to fail.
Yeah.
So Epstein got to a point where the CIA and the Mossad probably had to help him.
Right. Which is why this is the answer that makes the most sense when they say, if Biden had the goods on Trump, why didn't he release the Epstein files himself? That this would have been to reveal not donors, but a coordinated effort by American intelligence that were working with him and Israeli intelligence that was working with him. And then you get into Ghislaine Maxwell's father and his connections, and the whole thing starts to make perfect sense in that light. And this is still not the main story that you hear on the major news networks. This is still not the thread they're pulling on, and it's
Yes.
confusing to me.
And Keir Starmer has to start his speeches with, we have to think about the survivors. And I made a mistake to appoint Mandelson because of the survivors. But Mandelson is gay and has never molested anyone. Rather, he sold British state secrets about the 500 billion euro bailout in the wake of the 2008 financial crisis that allowed Epstein's friend to make hundreds of millions of dollars by having that information in advance. And he did that for a corrupt kickback for his boyfriend who was taking an osteopath course. And when you begin to look into all of this, and this is only one tiny example that's come to light, I'm sure there are many more examples of elite officials screwing over their countries and their taxpayers. The irony is that this was a guy who wasn't even having young women trafficked to him. He was just Epstein's friend.
Yeah. Look, the rabbit holes I could go down, and the Trump-Russia connections are very real, and we could talk about them at length. But rather, I just want to go to Alex Acosta, the original arrest, the sweetheart deal. Still, no explanation that sits well with me. What insights do you have there? Why would it be that this guy, who they had the goods on him, as you said, starting all the way in the Southern District of New York, there were agents that were receiving calls from these gynecologists and others that were raising questions like, what exactly is this guy up? And everybody passed. And then when they finally had him in the crosshairs, he gets 1 year in prison, a reduced charge down to soliciting prostitution from a minor when they had far greater goods on him. 1 year in jail with 6 days a week. He gets to leave prison. And then afterwards, it's swept under the rug, and the elites come rushing back to a guy who, even with the reduced charge, I still would not want to hang out with a guy who solicited prostitution from a minor. And yet they all went rushing back to him. And Alex Acosta then later gets put into Trump's administration for a job, quite frankly, I don't fully understand how he was qualified for. Labor secretary, he was a prosecutor. None of it makes sense. Can you help some of it make sense?
It does make sense, though, Michael. It makes sense because there's been a cover-up and it's been rigged the whole time. So I host a podcast called Disorder, and I've had your colleague and friend Jordan Harbinger on it, and I've been on his pod. I was really fortunate 2 weeks ago to interview an Epstein survivor, Rena O, and a lawyer for no fewer than 9 Epstein victims by the name of Lisa Bloom. And it was my colleague, Mark Lobel, who actually did the interview, but on my podcast. And what Lisa Bloom says is these things showcase that in the United States, there has always been one law for billionaires and one for everyone else. And I've run into this a little bit when I'm trying to get justice because someone has screwed me over and the boiler shed is built illegally. You just face the lawyer fees, and it's like, oh, the lawyer fees are $900 an hour. And to get to the point of suing the guy over the boiler shed, which isn't even worth much money, you can't afford it. If you're a regular guy, even a middle-class guy, justice is beyond us. So the flip side of that is when the prosecutors hear a thing from Epstein, they're like, we can't go against this guy. He's going to grind us down at court. Or he has powerful protectors who are going to pay $1,000 lawyers, $1,000 an hour lawyers to just make us shut up. And then there's the UK libel laws, and there's a whole range of things, which is the political appointees in the US that make it really, really difficult to go after powerful people. So that's the meta context of Alex Acosta. And it is not conspiratorial to say he was clearly tipped off before they came to Palm Beach. The number of girls who, leaving his place there, were like, I thought I was going to pay for this massage and then I got molested. It's come out that there's like 27 of them having called the Palm Beach police before, years and years later, he's put away for the most minor thing ever.
Yeah. I'm slightly unsatisfied with, and I know how the rich do work, and you're right. They can make it hell for a DA trying to prosecute them. I just think of here in Los Angeles what Scientology did in order to get their tax exempt status, which was, they just threw lawsuits at the Justice Department to the point where the Justice Department said, we can't handle all these lawsuits. It would take us all of our resources to handle every lawsuit that the Church of Scientology threw at us. Therefore, we're just going to give you what you want. So I understand that money does offer a different form of justice, but when you get into
or injustice,
of course, they don't get justice; they get injustice, and they pay for it. But with all that we're learning, and then the fact that it seems that Acosta was rewarded by Trump, it stinks of something larger to me, that everybody on the inside wasn't just afraid of what Epstein could throw at them with his money and his lawyers, but was the goods he had on everyone. That there was the word coming down from the top, this guy gets a sweetheart deal.
100%. And I mean, it's not surprising to anyone who has lived the world of policy to find out if you're connected to the right people, you're more likely to make policy. Not because your idea or your mastery of Arabic is better, or the peer review citations in your Oxford University Press book were better than the other guys. That's just not the way policy works. He knew the right people, and therefore both Dems and Repubs, Florida and New York and New Mexico, he was untouchable. And this is clearly connected to services that he rendered to CIA, Mossad, probably also MI6, and tragically also the Russians. And I can direct you to another podcast, which is The Rest is Classified, where they talk about how Russian intelligence probably used him differently than the others. He may have used Mossad and CIA. The Russians may have used him.
Yeah.
And again, I'm not an intelligence operative, so I can't explain exactly why that's the case, but it's spelled out quite well there. I want to bring this back to Iran because we're sitting here in the beginning of March after the war has started.
Yeah.
We have to realize that people make decisions, good and bad, not for the real reasons of which they articulate the decision. And Epstein is like the greatest example of this phenomenon. Sarkozy was the leading rah guy for the NATO no-fly zone over Libya that led to Gaddafi's being ousted in 2011. What do you know? Later, Sarkozy went to jail because he had taken illegal funds in his mayoral campaign from Gaddafi, and he went to war to have Gaddafi killed to largely cover up that fact. This is a story which is shockingly underreported in the US, but it was known while it was happening. I think that the NATO no-fly zone was a reasonable idea, and I'm willing to defend it. But Sarkozy didn't do it because of saving civilians in Benghazi. He did it because he wanted to kill the guy who had the goods on him. So whatever we're debating about the merits of the decapitation of the Ayatollahs, and there are potentially merits.
Yep.
That's just not the reason why Trump did it. Do you think that Trump cares about those protesters in Iran? Do we think that he cares of spreading democracy for the Iranian people? Give me a break.
If for one, he's killing protesters in the streets of America and eroding democracy in America. So those are two things he clearly doesn't care about, not even in his own country. So let's just take that off the table.
The amount of inside dealing, the favors to Netanyahu or potentially the Saudis, and it's complicated because there are different Gulfi players who don't want regime change in Iran, and some who do, and some who wanted the supreme leader killed, but not the war to continue. I mean, so there are many there are many different stakeholders here. Trump has triangulated between the stakeholders, but the timing is exclusively about Epstein. There was not this kind of foreign adventurism like with Maduro, like now in Iran, before these documents came out. I mean, the extent of the violation of international law, which is kidnapping a sovereign of a foreign country, or essentially having a decapitation, beheading of all of the elites of a foreign sovereign entity. We've never seen that. In not even in World War II were we able to achieve things like this.
No. And we're not even talking about it. Maduro comes up in the conversation 0% of the time nowadays. Let me just go to the extreme and say what the conspiracy theorists are saying is that we are at war with Libya, and all of our adventurism on behalf of Israel is because Netanyahu has the goods on Trump. That
You meant we're at war with Iran.
Yeah, Iran. Sorry, yeah. Is Netanyahu has the goods on Trump, and that which is, you know, what people will say why we're not supporting Ukraine in the way that we should be supporting Ukraine is that Putin's got the goods on Trump. That a lot of people are saying that these foreign intelligence agencies have information on Trump and are controlling them, that he and the narrative, or more to the point, the evidence that Trump has been manipulated by the Russians starting in the 80s when he went on an all expense paid trip of Russia, paid for by the Kremlin, the KGB, and then came home and took out full page ads in major American newspapers. The cheapest guy in the world suddenly spending out of his own pocket big money to take out full page ads. This is all true. This is not conspiracy theory. Saying, why are we in NATO? Literally, Putin's wet dream, break up NATO. Donald Trump was a voice for that as early as the 80s. And, you know, experts who say the KGB obviously would look for a corrupt businessman who likes women. There's your guy to manipulate. It's so easy. Donald Trump would have been a target for the KGB.
And he happens to be a racist, and his father happened to be sued for not letting blacks rent certain apartment buildings. That's exactly what they wanted. I find that very compelling. And I want to quote my Disorder former co-host, Arthur Snell, who is a former British diplomat and has worked in, you know, a range of intelligence and diplomatic capacities. It is difficult to point to a thing that Donald Trump has done which he wouldn't do if he was a Russian asset. And it is difficult to point to a way of behaving that he has engaged in that if the Russians had compromised on him, they wouldn't want him to do. I think that the Israel-Iran angle is slightly different.
Okay.
I can make a million arguments of why it is obvious that it is in the U.S. interest for Ukraine to win. And it is exactly against our interests for the Russians to control Donbass or to potentially assassinate Zelensky. That's not in our interest. However, when it comes to Iran, there is a long-standing part of both the Republican and Democratic parties, neocon and archcon. So from John Bolton all the way through to, you know, regular Patrick Moynihan Democrats who have said the Ayatollahs are our implacable enemy and we should pursue regime change. So from Carter to the present, there has been a stream of American foreign policy thinking, which is that we would benefit ourselves by overthrowing the Iranian regime, right? And you don't need to look to the Israelis having compromised on Trump to explain why, you know, this long-seated American foreign policy interest is now manifesting itself. It's just the question of how it's manifesting itself.
Yeah. Well, it does seem like, and Marco Rubio has even said as much, that the Israelis, this is their thing, and we're following them. That the most powerful military, and by the way, the country that gives Israel so much of their money, is being dictated to how to use our military. Rubio said just yesterday, I don't know if you heard that.
I did, yes.
Yeah, he said something to the effect of, "Well, they were going to Israel was going to attack anyway, so we had to. We had to. We're being dictated how to, when and how to go to war by a much smaller country, by the way, that also in large part exists because of American largesse, or I will use that word generously. It could be there's a number of other ways to describe why America puts as much money into the Israeli military as we do."
I think that some of what you said is correct. Some of it I don't agree with. It is a little too far for me.
Okay.
I don't think that there's an anti-Semitic conspiracy theory that explains, oh, Zionists are so high up in the U.S. government and they've convinced the U.S. to do something which is against its interests in
Not Zionists.
giving money.
I mean, Zionists as in Christian nationalists, but there is an element in American government, and particularly in this right-wing Trump government, of Christian nationalists who truly believe that in the book of, I guess it would be.
Of course, and what Huckabee has said is absolutely insane.
Yeah,
so
absolutely insane.
Can I finish this thought process?
What's that?
May I finish this thought process?
Yes, sure, of course.
There are obviously both Christian Zionists and Jewish Zionists in America and in Israel who advocate policies that are not in the U.S. interest or are grounded in mystical thinking, either about the end times or the ingathering of the Jews, or if only, the settlers could control this tiny piece of land, which are not in American interests. However, there is also a case, which is that Israel is a technological and AI superpower, not solely because we've gifted it to them, but because they've earned it. And they are doing certain things in the region, which not only America, but other powers like the UAE, Saudi, Egypt, European allies, even Greece. So the Greeks have really changed their position in a more pro-Israeli way. Cyprus is another example. And there is something to be said for the John McCain view, who was clearly not owned or bought or paid for by either Christian Zionists or by Israeli intelligence, that the U.S.-Israeli relationship strengthens American deterrence. I'm not a neocon, so I don't believe that, but I think it's really important having this debate that there is no argument that letting Russia win in Ukraine or NATO to break up benefits U.S. strategic interests. It doesn't. That simply weakens America as we're confronting China, as we're confronting jihadism. And the situation with Israel and Iran is not like that. There's a complicated situation of which it may be in our interest to actually get rid of the Iranian regime. It's just that we happen to do it in an illegal way, exactly at the timing that distracts from Trump being unpopular and more Epstein revelations being on the cusp of coming out.
Yeah, I would agree with all of that. It's worth mentioning the thinking that we see, because, as you said, we're allowing the fringes to have their voices right now and people to rush to the fringes because the middle seems to be in some sort of strange state of I don't know what it is, other than the consolidation of the media in America, where people are afraid of their jobs. But you don't hear the more reasonable positions on the Epstein files right now on CNN or even on MSNBC. It's guys like you and me that are talking about it on podcasts, but I'm not hearing a lot of other people talk about it. I don't want to take up too much of your time. You've been so generous with it.
I want to make another point on this, though.
Please, yeah, of course.
You hit the nail on the head there. We have to say that something has failed in the mainstream media ecosystem and in the mainstream political ecosystem. This is why the Pete Buttigieg's and Gavin Newsom's and Gretchen Whitmer's did not emerge to combat Harris. There was a stitch up.
Yeah.
It's also the same reason why the New York Times is not lending its megaphone to saying, you know what, we really screwed up when we didn't investigate this story, and we have this and this journalism. They're not doing that. They were only doing it when pushed. They weren't out in front. And I think until this is gotten right, in other words, until people are able to lead boldly from the center, we're in a lot of trouble. I liked Keir Starmer when he was campaigning because he's a center-left guy. He wants to, raise the minimum wage, get the health service to work better, restore Britain's role in Europe, like all the stuff that a regular center-left guy would do. But then he gets into office and he just doesn't have the power and the boldness. And I think that a big trick that we need to point out is that people on our side have mostly tended to be scared of their own shadow.
Yeah.
That they're just not capable of writing that vigorous op-ed saying, these are the problems. This is what I would do. And I think that in this moment, if we just denounce everything that Trump says, everything this, that, and the other is just so corrupt, so bad, without counter proposals, governable, legitimate counter proposals, we're then not providing those solutions. So on my Disorder podcast, we really try to focus on the solutions rather than just.
What are the solutions that you see? I've been saying for the last week that whoever I vote for in the primaries has got to say they're going to break up these mergers, that the Ellisons can't possibly own everything. This is, in the old days, the United States government was in the business of breaking up monopolies. Now we seem to be in the business of creating them to the benefit of one ideology. What solutions are you proposing?
That's a great point. So I was reading an article today that Elon Musk has 10 times the money that Rockefeller had at his peak before everyone realized that the antitrust stuff needed to break him up. So we do live in a neo-mercantilist world, and I love a very Elizabeth Warren approach to antitrust. That actually is not one of the solutions that we talk about on the Disorder podcast, because I would say we're talking about climate change one week, and then we're talking about NATO another week. We're not as U.S. domestically focused. Solutions that I talk about are the Europeans leading. So I don't think that this Iran war has gone down particularly well. Why is it that the Europeans can't say, rather than going to the Qataris or the Omanis to mediate between Iran and Israel, we can do this in Paris or London with the EU, UK, and Switzerland presenting a rather larger economy than a small Gulf state. But they haven't. All the mediation, if we go back to the hostages, yes, the Qataris had key relationships with Hamas. But do you think that if the Europeans worked together and said, we're going to try to get these 20 hostages and end the war and do a ceasefire, that they wouldn't have been able to mediate as well as the Qataris? Qatar is a country with 300,000 people. And this is an example of something that just blows my mind. And it has to do with the fact that the Germans and the Irish and the Spanish all have different policies towards Israel-Palestine. And even as this war has come about, the British are doing something different than the French. The British are allowing their bases to be used for defensive operations, and the French are not. It's like McFly, can't we get a European position? Because then they could present something that would be a counterweight to Trump. But McFly, hello. If the French are doing the opposite of the British and then the Germans have a different position than the French, of course it's not a counterweight. So I use this as an example. I talk about a democratic board of peace. I was really proud of Mark Carney when he stood up at Davos and said, if you tariff me, we're going to tariff you, and we're going to present an alternative. Why can't the Europeans say, maybe we have some problems working together? We'll let Carney be our spokesperson. And if there's another nonsense of Greenland taking over Greenland, we're going to tariff the US so hard that the dollar is going to tank, and those manufacturing jobs and soybean farming jobs in red states are going to be so hard hit, you're going to be demolished in the midterms. There's going to be 65 Democratic senators. There is nothing preventing a meeting of the G6 announcing this. If they had announced this in advance, I call it like Carney's moment to be the mega orderer, Trump would never mention the word Greenland again. But because they can't be on the same page, they make it seem to Trump like, oh, the democracies are so disunited. And these are the kind of solutions that we talk about, because I'm rubbing shoulders in European chancelleries and think tanks here. This stuff is achievable. It's just that they don't do it.
Yeah, which, is the talking point of Xi in China, that the democracies have failed. And in some ways, but you're right, Carney, he's really a rising star. My only pushback to what you said was that you feel like they could put pressure onto Trump where he'd get destroyed in the midterms. And right now he is working to see to it that the midterms are going to go his way, no matter what, through anti-democratic means. We are in a real moment, and there's so much more to talk about. And you mentioned Greenland, and I got my thoughts on that. I think that has more to do with people like Peter Thiel and their desire for autonomous freedom cities and things like that.
And rare earth.
And climate change, that they're trying to buy a piece of land where they can inhabit just the billionaires. Again, rabbit holes. I'm not saying I have the goods on these, but these are thoughts that cross my mind, and I have a big mouth, so I say them anyway, even though I can't bring the exact receipts. But Jason, what an honor. What a great conversation. You're so knowledgeable. Would you please remind everyone where they can find you? I know you also have a Substack, because I subscribe to it myself. But
Thank you. This was a great conversation. Great to be on your show, and maybe we'll do a Greenland or midterm follow-up.
I would love that.
My podcast is Disorder. You may find it wherever fine podcasts are purveyed, such as Spotify and Apple Podcasts. My Substack is called Ordering the Disorder. I assume that these things will be linked to in your show notes. And
yes,
the whole idea of the Ordering the Disorder is there really are concrete things that can be done. And in the US, I love the antitrust stuff. I also love the idea of reclaiming some kind of religious center ground. I'm not as anti-theist as you, but the James Tallarico, like, hey, Jesus would want to tax billionaires. That's a solution that, why have we not been saying this the whole time? If you like Jesus, you like taxes.
Yeah. Give unto Caesar. Also, I've said many times that thus far, and we don't have them all yet, but the Epstein files is 3 million pages. It's a 3 million page argument for taxing the rich. Give me a break.
Oh my God. It is the greatest argument, not only for taxing the rich, but for preventing parts of the global economy and power elites into which we have no visibility.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Jason. And I will be including all your links in the show notes. And I look forward to our follow-up episode as the midterms get closer. Thanks again.
Thank you so much.